Hello, everyone. As some of you know, I am working on some new content. I'm talking with a lot of very interesting people about a lot of interesting topics. Recently, I had a chance to sit down with one of my former professors from the University of Southern Mississippi, Dr. Robert Pauly. Dr. Robert J. Pauly Jr. is a tenured full professor of international development at the University of Southern Mississippi. His research interests focus broadly on the fields of U.S. foreign policy, national security, and homeland security, with emphasis on the intersection between transatlantic relations and American policy toward the states of the greater Middle East. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 8 books and nearly 50 academic articles, essays, and book chapters, including most recently, American Nation Building, Case Studies from Reconstruction to Afghanistan. He co-edits the academic journal White House Studies, works regularly with the Council on Foreign Relations Academic Outreach Initiatives, serves as a senior analysis for the international consulting group Wikistrat, and analyzes U.S. foreign policy and national security issues with emphasis on Europe and the greater Middle East for a range of electronic and print media outlets. This was a very good conversation. We actually had it about 2 weeks ago, before Russia invaded Ukraine, I should say. And today I asked him to do a quick follow-up. Right now, it's February 25th. I just got finished talking to him, and we discussed, obviously the latest and breaking news. So I'm not quite ready to release the full content of the full project that I'm doing, but I wanted to go ahead and get this conversation online, given the current events, because Dr. Pauly provides some really valuable insights. So check out this conversation and be sure to stay toward the end for that for the current and update conversation. So thank you.
But real quick, so I was looking up, and it seems like really this whole Ukraine situation is a long history of even before the Soviet Union was even a thing, it was even formally created, going back to, as far back to my studies as I looked at, as, Russia invading Germany, the discontent that came with that, the rise of the Soviet Union, pushing back on Western influence and such. So can you talk to me a little bit about kind of what led to the to kind of the global stage that we're seeing right now?
Okay, no problem at all. So it's very important to consider the history of the region and the role of the present actors therein that dates back many, many centuries, as you've already noted. So let's go back. Historically, Russia has always felt the need for a buffer zone between Russia proper, depending on whatever size it's been, and it's changed in terms of extent of size over time, and those states that it views as adversaries. So you already touched a bit upon the history of the world wars, and that's probably a good place to start, because if we look at World War I and World War II, what Russia was looking for in a variety of ways, that time the Russian Empire, and midway through World War I, when it bowed out, actually became the Soviet Union in 1917. But they've always looked for that buffer zone. And the principal adversary that the Russians had in World War I was Germany. And so they were looking for a buffer zone, between Germany, and typically Poland falls within that space, as well as some what are presently states in Central and Eastern Europe. So that was the Russians' concern then. It was the concern of the Soviet Union during World War II. And again, Germany was viewed as that adversary. In both cases, interestingly enough, different times that this occurred, they essentially struck, the Germans and Soviets struck a separate peace. World War I, it was Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia bowing out with the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union. And in World War II, it was the separate peace between the Germans and the Soviets, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And in both cases, particularly the latter, the agreement ended up biting the Russians, and that Germany eventually just overlooked it and then invaded. And that came about in the June of 1941. So they've had this historical concern with buffer space. If you
Right.
look at the Cold War, the buffer zone for Russia and the Soviet Union were the states of Central and Eastern Europe, which fell into a grouping known as the Warsaw Pact. So to Moscow, that was the buffer zone between it and its principal adversary, the United States, and US allies in Western Europe during World War II. And so let's talk about moving toward the present period, talk about the aftermath of the Cold War, which came to a close. You can date it anywhere between November 1989 with the fall of the wall in Berlin and essentially the elimination of communist regimes across that buffer zone, Central and Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. And so you had that transformation, and Russia's concern then was, well, there's no more buffer zone. The Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, and one of the things that happened, in that aftermath was that over time NATO enlarged, which leaves us where we are, enlarged basically across all of Central and Eastern Europe, and now includes some states that were members of the Soviet Union itself, most notably the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Those three states, and at that, so those three states are all now in NATO. All these states in Central and Eastern Europe are in NATO. So what happens with the Russia is there's no more buffer zone left. Right. And so strategically, Vladimir Putin, now the president of Russia, he's alternatively served as president, prime minister, president, and through a variety of different means has stayed in office a lot longer than the original law at the end of the Cold War would have allowed, when you had the establishment of the Russian Federation. And so his means to exert pressure or to respond to what he views as an encroachment on his territory through the enlargement of NATO has been to take action within states that were members of the Soviet Union, are no longer, but are very closely affiliated with Russia, or either were, or he was intimidated to get them to be closely affiliated with Russia again. The first of this actually happened before Putin even came to power. Very quickly, and I mention this for a reason, because the methods used in each of these cases were very similar, even when Putin was not in charge. So in 1992, Russia intervened in a region in the state of Moldova that borders that actually borders Ukraine and Moldova in the east, known as Transnistria.
And that was in 1992?
Yes, 1992. And
now real quick,
model. Yes, go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
Real quick, let me. So the Soviet Union fell in 91. So that happened in 92. So who was leader at that point? Was that
was Yeltsin?
Okay.
Just in the immediate aftermath. So Yeltsin, yes, okay. Yeltsin. This actually happened under Yeltsin, the first case. But the way in which it was carried out, essentially, you had pressure put on Moldova that resulted in them giving up Transnistria.
Okay.
What you find in this region is actually a mix of Russian and Ukrainian speakers, but none that were really fell necessarily within what you would view as a traditional Moldovan identity. So that's the means through which Russia also acted. This under Putin, in this considerable period of time, 16 years passed before the next action occurs. And this action is really set up by the enlargement of NATO, as I mentioned, through Central and Eastern Europe, which formally took place between the late 90s and early 2000s. So you had that movement, bunch of new states entered NATO, to the point where now NATO has 30 different countries. It essentially has doubled, almost exactly doubled in size since the end of the Cold War. And so there were increasing pushes by other states within the former Soviet Union that were not as closely affiliated to the Russians, that were trying to gain a measure of autonomy, and had sort of they were engaged in discussions with both the EU and NATO about joining those institutions. Russia, in response, in 2008, right, oddly, interestingly enough, right as the Summer Olympics were getting underway, and there'll be some parallels here as well, intervened in Georgia on the premise of abuse of the rights of ethnic Russian speakers in Abkhazia and North Ossetia, and this is in the Caucasus region bordering Georgia and Russia. And they use the same means, largely in cases where they exert pressure economically, politically, and build up mass forces along the border and send in special forces to kind of create a bit of commotion and a bit of an uprising among those actors. So ultimately, that essentially meant that greater autonomy is granted to those regions. And now they're both under Russian protection.
Right.
Georgia has not joined NATO, nor will Ukraine for that matter. Notwithstanding the disputes that go back and forth, in practical terms, that's not on the table from NATO perspective. Even though NATO won't say that formally, won't exclude anyone from ever joining, in practice, they're not. Ukraine's not joining, Georgia's not joining.
It understands that.
And third thing, just let me one quick more point. I know I want to get some questions in as well, but the next point, and these are all connected, is so in 2014, spring of 2014, right at the end of the Sochi Winter Olympics, which Russia was hosted at that time, Russia intervened in Ukraine. On the premise, at that time, there was a president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was favorably disposed toward the Russians. He was forced from power through a series of largely peaceful protests and uprisings. He was replaced by Petro Poroshenko, ended up being the president. And Russia intervened militarily to try to stir some tensions, both in the Donbass, where we're currently seeing the existing problems, and also in the Crimea, which gives Russia historically access to the Black Sea.
Yeah.
They did this through what are, known in our terms, we would call little green men. So you had Russian special forces, not in uniform, that again tried to bolster support in both those regions for some greater degree of Russian control. Ended up actually holding an election in Crimea, which the vast majority of Crimeans are Russian speaking. And it's open to question how legitimate that election was. It might well have been legitimate in terms of the majority voting via referendum on the spot in the spring of 2014 to join Russia. So Russia annexed Crimea, notwithstanding repeated demands from the United States, its NATO allies, other neighboring states in the region. They're not giving it back.
Right.
And there's kind of been a back and forth, and there's been continual tensions in the Donbass, eastern Ukraine bordering Russia ever since, which leads us to the present scenario. Oftentimes, new presidents are tested. That's common, no matter who it is. Doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump, doesn't matter if it's Joe Biden, Barack Obama, whoever it may be. They're always going to be tested, and Vladimir Putin's one that will always do this. He started early on in his and the Biden administration last year. There's some moves, increasing force presence in Ukraine, sending naval vessels into the region, and there was not a really strident or significant U.S. response. That gave to in Putin's mind, well, I can pretty much do the same thing that I did in Georgia in 2008, that I did in Ukraine in 2014. This time, maybe I can come in and either gain at least increasing control in the Donbass, but really take that altogether, annex it.
Yeah.
And in the process, maybe I can change the security architecture more broadly in Europe. Let's see how hard I can push and what the response will be. And that kind of leads us to where we are now.
Yeah. It's interesting because I got a lot more questions about the history and kind of the lead up to this. But one thing I wanted to just try to wrap my head around as far as where we're at right now and what's imminent. From what I understand, Russia has the number 2 military in the world, obviously behind us. Ukraine, obviously nowhere even remotely close to that, but it's not from the sources I was reading. It's not as just of Russia versus Ukraine. Russia still has to defend all of its assets and territories and such around the world. So it's not like Ukraine could possibly feel the full brunt of, if you will, of the Russian military and with all the United States with NATO and all of this stuff. I really don't. The more I read about it, I don't really feel like a Russian invasion is imminent with Ukraine.
Okay, let me go over a couple of points. You mentioned the severe distinction between overwhelming Russian military assets on one hand and Ukrainian military assets on the other. So that's one issue. Let me give you a couple of numbers that do reflect this, and I'll be quick, and then we can talk about where NATO comes into the equation, and what forces Russia actually has right in the vicinity now. So Russia overall is about 900,000 active duty forces. Ukraine's got 209,000. Pretty big discrepancy. But as you mentioned, Russia has a lot more territory to cover. Russia has 9,780 tanks, Ukraine 2,172. Artillery, Russia has 5,725 pieces of artillery, Ukraine 1,962. And some of the more significant distinctions come as we go through even more significant assets. Surface-to-air missile launchers, this is very important in the region, and this is really the area that Ukraine has asked in the past and right up to the present for ways to use its own lethal weapons to defend itself, Javelin anti-tank missiles in particular. So Russia's got surface-to-air missile launchers, 151. Ukraine's got 90. Combat aircraft, Russia's got 1,857. Ukraine doesn't have much of an air force, only 160. And then if you look in the Black Sea alone, which is very important in terms of both exerting pressure and if you want to invade and bring forces in of various types, Russia's got 10 naval assault vessels of various sizes in the Black Sea right now, several motoring toward the port of Odessa and western Ukraine on the Black Sea. Ukraine no longer has the port in Crimea because Russia took it. So that's out of the equation already. And so you have those issues. In addition, in the region, there are approximately 60,000 Russian forces, various types of hardware and growing on the eastern border with the Donbass. In addition, there are 50 to 60,000, latest count that I've been able to discern, massed along the border between Belarus and Ukraine. Belarus is a friendly power to Russia. Their leader, Alexander Lukashenko, I call him Little Putin. Same type of attitude, same type of perspective, not nearly the assets that Putin has.
No, geographically, I can't. Is that to the east or west of Ukraine?
To the north.
To the north. Okay.
To the north.
Okay.
And Russia routinely holds military exercises. So they've got about 60,000 forces and assets in there on the premise that we're holding war games. This is nothing out of the ordinary.
Oh yeah, naturally, of course.
And then I mentioned the ships moving toward the port of Odessa. So that's the Russian buildup, what we have at this point. And so the question is, what is Putin trying to achieve here? And B, what can the United States and its NATO allies do about it?
Now, one of the, I guess the big question is really, why? I mean, what's the importance of Ukraine? But I think we kind of we touched on it as far as, that buffer zone and, reading and studying foreign policy and the history of just not only Europe, but the world and such. You read about whether it be Hitler or Napoleon invading Russia and then having to tuck their tail between their legs and run back. And it seems like that buffer zone is obviously a big part of that. And so I guess I'm wondering, the states within that buffer zone, Ukraine, all of these countries, do they? At the height of the Soviet Union, when they were in the Soviet Union, did they feel just like a puppet to the Soviet Union and just part of a strategic alliance, if you will, or did they feel, culturally and politically tied to them? I guess I'm trying to figure out. I mean, did these states? Obviously, different
first
states.
Of all, there was no choice. I mean. They were part of the Soviet Union. That was it. There was no sense of anyone rebelling during the Cold War itself. When it was tried twice in Central and Eastern Europe. Both cases, the Russians rolled in and just squashed it. 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in the Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring movement. But it differed in the aftermath of when you got toward the end of the Cold War. You started to see peaceful movements, solidarity in Poland. Increasing movement in East Germany, Czech Republic, and it really felt like a house of cards at the end of the 1980s. What Putin is trying to do now So in terms of there was some cultural affinity, but not enough to make a difference. It was
Okay.
only when there was kind of a window of opportunity, and a number of these states in the aftermath of the Cold War, the Soviets in a very bad condition. They're not able to do much of anything, and they weren't indicating they were going to do much of anything in response, and they really didn't.
Yeah.
And so, at that point, you had Russian minorities in those countries in each of them, but most of them in the aftermath of the Cold War did feel a distinct need or wanted to move toward independence, except for Lukashenko's Belarus. No movement at all. The other thing is that we need to look at it a little more broadly, and so move a little bit further to the east. We mentioned Georgia. That was the one state out of the region that sort of did act out.
Mm-hmm.
None of the other ones have. All the former Central Asian Soviet republics, the variety of different stands in that region that most noted in recent years for Afghanistan. The Russians have kept close to those areas throughout the post-Cold War era. They haven't. There's been no sense that any other state's going to come in there, and they actually established an organization known as the Collective Security Treaty Organization that includes all those former stands, Belarus, as well as Armenia and Azerbaijan. And most recently, anytime if there's a threat to the regime or uprising in one of those countries, Russia stands ready to, by invitation, in most cases it probably is by invitation because the leaders there are largely authoritarian still and rely on Russia for support. So most recently, earlier this year, you had an uprising in Kazakhstan. Russian forces were on the streets. That was put down pretty quickly and back to stability. So, but the idea that the West is alone in developing these types of organizations and still exerting this type of control is totally inaccurate. The Russians are doing the same types of things. They're just annoyed that we've done so much of it on their borders in the East, which they used to rely upon as a buffer zone.
Yeah.
In terms of, you'd ask what is Russia trying to achieve here? A whole bunch of different things, but I can come up with, I'll give you a list of 4 to start off with. So always, Russia broadly and Vladimir Putin, a state that was formerly one of the 2 superpowers in the Cold War, he wants to recapture that image. He's not going to be able to do it all the way, but he's interested in international prestige. All states are, particularly past and present global powers. So he doesn't want it to appear that the Russians can be pushed around, and he wants to make it appear, he wants to at least try to say, hey, we can push the West generally, but especially the United States around.
Right.
And we've got leverage to do this. And so that's his point. We want to recapture some past glory. 2, he does want as much control as he can have within those former Soviet states. He wants it. He's got all those countries in Central Asia. They're not going to present any problem to any longer. Georgia's not going to present a problem anymore after what happened. Belarus is with him. So kind of the one sore thumb that's sticking out where he can try to exert some more control. He's already done it once, gotten away with it largely. He had some economic sanctions, but the United States and certainly the West more broadly, always very reluctant under the Obama administration to provide any sort of defensive lethal weapons. They give me a lot of military equipment, but nothing that you could use to fight the other side.
Right.
And so he thinks he can get it. What are they going to do? I can get away with it again. So I can use this history where I've done what Russia did in Moldova, what I did in Georgia, what I did in Ukraine previously. I can do it again, and I can get away with it. And maybe I can get some measure of greater Russian control over the Donbass. What measure of control becomes it's going to depend on the response, which we can talk about next.
Yeah.
But I think in Putin's mind, he thinks he can probably withstand any cost. That was his thinking going in. Whether that remains the case, when I talk about some of the potential things that could happen to him, we'll see. 3rd point, intimidation of European Union and NATO member states, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. The Baltics, I mentioned previously, countries like Poland, Romania. Those are all in that area, that former buffer zone. And so he's trying to intimidate these states that some are very dependent on him, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and some in Western Europe too, we'll talk about in a minute, for energy resources, particularly natural gas shipments. It's the middle of winter now. So he thinks he can get some leverage there. So, but mainly, we're not a nothing power is what he's telling the Europeans. Maybe the Cold War is not over. Still better be wary of us.
Right. And I feel like at this point that the Cold War is almost not over. I feel like it kind of was, but I feel like it's almost starting to bubble up again. Or maybe it just never went away, and we're just.
I think it's bubbled up again for a variety of reasons, and really I think came to a head in Ukraine in 2014. That we could talk a long time about the changing mission of NATO in the aftermath of the Cold War, but as a short kind of a lightning explanation of it, NATO came out of the end of the Cold War without a mission. There was no more Soviet Union. There was some discussion whether it even needed to continue. And so NATO's mission changed, really it's changed in three ways since then, in three stages. First change was we got to find something to do, but we had a ready-made solution in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Where the Serbs, we had essentially the Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims at each other's throats, but primarily it was the Serbs who were winning, and there was a lot of civilian death in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So here's our chance. The Europeans tried to do something on their own, couldn't do it. So it was left to the United States and NATO to intervene. So that's our mission now. That's our role. So that was expanded after 9/11. Only time Article 5, the Common Defense article in the North Atlantic Treaty was ever invoked after the terrorist attacks. Suddenly NATO's mission is even further afield, providing assistance and support to U.S. operations in Afghanistan. The short descriptive term used at the time was out of area or out of business. Okay. Things are starting to go south in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. There was a promised withdrawal. It ended up being scaled back by the Obama administration from Afghanistan. 2014. What else happens in 2014? In the spring of 2014, intervention in Ukraine. Suddenly, the Russian boogeyman is back. Yeah, and there's an excuse that we can use. We're back. We can be back to our original mission. Here we are. We've got that same threat right there.
Yeah, it seems like it's just different days, same problem. I mean, it's over 100 years of just fighting over these old countries from the old Soviet Union. And one thing that is
not necessarily fighting. I mean, more jockeying for position, because the one thing that the tool that Russia doesn't fear here, notwithstanding the rhetoric about NATO enlargement and such, we've got to exclude ever allowing Ukraine or any other countries further east in NATO. Practical terms, that's not going to happen. Also, in practical, even publicly, NATO, the United States, has ruled out any consideration of using our forces against Russian forces in Ukraine. That will not occur. Right. We'll give them equipment to help defend themselves. We'll sanction them economically in a variety of ways, but we don't have a military tool we're willing to use for good reason. Russia and the United States are a major nuclear power. We're not going to take a chance of getting into a larger war with Russia over this. It's not going to happen.
And that kind of leads me to, there's always a big, and it's no secret, I follow, Rand Paul and these type of guys. I'm fairly, non-intervention. I try not to. I believe we don't need to get involved as much as we can. But it seems like, from my perspective, what I've seen a lot, when you look, and I'm talking just kind of overall and big in general, a lot of wars and a lot of just conflict, it takes place from, people from nations just trying to, kind of what we've been talking about up until now has kind of been the history of this nation jockeying for position, this nation jockeying for position. And it seems like, I know obviously it's easier said than done, but it seems like all of this conflict is because nobody's willing to just, not try to impose their will on others or grow. It kind of reminds me of the Europe of the Roman Empire. It seems like And you could debate all day about exactly why the Roman Empire fell, which there are a variety of reasons, but I do feel like a big portion of it was spreading themselves too far. And so I don't. It just seems like with the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of that was them spreading themselves too far. And I'm just curious, as as we move on, are we going to see the United States or the European power in general, European powers in general, make that same mistake? What's your thoughts on that?
I'm less concerned about a war in the heart of Europe. I think where we've seen those types of conflicts, those type of hot wars, have been in other places since the end of the Cold War. Iraq, certainly, if we look at hindsight, it was a serious mistake by the George W. Bush administration to intervene in Iraq on the premise of a set of threats that had to do with nuclear, biological, chemical warfare that you found. They did find some materials there, but the idea of a nuclear program ready to be completed and strike, that ended up being a myth. Also, it was the premise that, Iraq supported the terrorists that were responsible for 9/11. That was also not the case. And while that wasn't directly asserted by the administration, it was suggested. And that approach, if we look at the cost-benefit analysis, it was a big mistake to go in there. We could have contained Iraq as we were doing. We wouldn't have had nearly the problems we've had there. I think it was the right decision to go in Afghanistan, but that was a decision where you had a strategic objective, which was to take out the Taliban and put.
And that was a direct response to 9/11.
Yeah, clearly, the direct response to 9/11. But that mission became clouded once we got there, and it evolved into, we need to put in a democratic government and make sure it stays in place. And then we're going to be forced to fight a continuing Taliban insurgency. And so it got out of control. If we look at the costs and benefits there, through the ultimate withdrawal, missed ham-handed effort in the withdrawal, but that's another story. That's another case where the costs vastly exceeded the benefits.
Yeah.
And if we look at hindsight, the idea that there was going to be a liberal democracy enduring in either Afghanistan or Iraq, it seems pretty far-fetched in hindsight.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that because of those interventions, I think we're going to be a lot more reluctant, no matter who's in charge, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter, to intervene in those types of places, given what impact, what threats are really posed to American lives by those places.
Yeah.
Less so. I mean, you can make a case in Afghanistan for becoming a terrorist training ground again. And there's some of that already occurring. And personally, I would have said you could probably afford to leave 5,000 to 10,000 forces there indefinitely, and just to maintain some degree of stability. But water under the bridge, that's done. So we don't have those responsibilities. I don't see us going back to those places in nearly the levels that we were there. And at the height of both those interventions, you were talking about, at the height in each place was in excess of 120, 130,000. Never that many in both places at the same time. But that's a pretty substantial level. By the time in the end came in each case, you were under 10,000. Even the last year or two in both of those cases. So we're not going to go back in those types of numbers. So I'm not as concerned about that. And I think that the circumstances in Europe are such that we're not going to take despite there's always a chance for miscalculation, but I don't see the United States taking the type of risk that would lead to a confrontation with Russia, a direct military confrontation. I can see, and I would support, the continuing stationing of U.S. forces under NATO command within countries in Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltics. Yeah, we've seen a few thousand more, a couple thousand more here and there in the last couple of weeks, but still, that's not a gigantic number, and it's not. We've had U.S. forces in those places for training purposes right on Russia's border for quite a long time now. And so I don't really fear a big pressure of escalation. Also, I mean, neither country is willing to sustain this type of costs over a place like Ukraine. So again, I think that played into Putin's strategy is, let's see how much I can get away with. And ultimately, they haven't invaded yet. So you always have that at the end. Maybe I can find a way to get out of this and get something for it. Question is, what can NATO do in response, and what can Russia still hope to get at this point?
Right. That is a good point of Afghanistan and the entirety of the Iraq war and that, the past 20 years is so new and so etched in people's mind that, jumping right in, we finally got it. And you could argue how much we're really out, but we're finally done with that. And now we're going to jump right back in. That's actually a really good point of people just, I feel like people aren't wanting any more conflict right now. We got enough problems at home, if you will.
And so that's kind of why. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one interesting thing that I've always been fascinated by the idea of, over the centuries, the strategic concerns and strategic, how they go about, choosing who to invade or how to posture their military, has obviously always been about, geographic strategy. We talked about that buffer zone. The United States has enjoyed a military strategy or advantage of having, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean on either side of us, if you will. And so, but nowadays, I think we're starting to see those geographic lines start to fade away as we get into digital, mass media, this type of thing. And so you're seeing those walls start to crumble where you can actually get in and change hearts and minds through culture and through trade and this type of stuff. And so one of the interesting facts as I was looking up more and preparing for this is, I guess, I apparently in the either late 70s or early 80s, somewhere around then, I guess some of the sources I saw, it said that punk rock actually helped create a bit of authority sentiment in Eastern Europe, which helped, arguably the question is how much it helped, but actually helped to convince Gorbachev to start pushing for more individual rights, getting rid of censorship, these type of things. So can you talk to me about that? I mean, was that more of a, and it might have just been a combination, but was that more of a understanding where the world is, and trying to, join the new world, or was it, hey, I have no choice because the youth of the of these states and these areas are coming after me, and I have to change just out of self-preservation?
Okay, that was one of the reasons we think about the end of the Cold War. I'm always one who's going to point to the actions of the Reagan administration that reduced the ability of the Soviet Union to pay the necessary cost to maintain the type of control it had in those places. And where it came to two different things: the Star Wars that the Reagan administration put forward, whether it was practically feasible or not, who knows? It wasn't the point. It was that the Soviets believed that we would pay to create it. We were stubborn enough, we had the resources that we could do it, and they knew they could not afford it. One of the reasons they couldn't afford it, and will also kind of led to negative sentiments against the government, happened to us in the same place, actually, Afghanistan, where Russia intervened in December 1979. The United States supported the Mujahideen, as did some other rather nefarious actors, including Al Qaeda. Well, what became Al Qaeda, and so we made it hard for the Russians to stay there about significant costs. We put in a total of about $3 billion, much of it to arm the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles. That the most effective Soviet weapon at that point in Afghanistan was their attack helicopters. Those missiles took those off the battlefield, and that's why the Soviets lost. They ended up withdrawing in 1989. This created a lot of negative sentiment in Russia, particularly among the youth, because you have young members of the military going there and dying.
Yeah.
Same thing we faced in Vietnam, United States. Same thing, technically, we start to think about Afghanistan, Iraq, same type of thing we faced in those places ourselves
For sure.
more recently. So that was those two things helped to push Gorbachev in that direction. Some of it had to do with him. He was the first, fairly young leader the Soviet Union had had in many decades. He was about 54, I believe, when he came to power after 3 successive Soviet leaders died one after the other.
Mm-hmm.
A period of about 2 years. And so lack of resources. And he said, well, maybe I can open up, maybe that'll relieve some of the pressure domestically. So glasnost, openness. Perestroika was the idea of economic restructuring. But when he started doing that there, it came concurrent with movements like Solidarity in Poland. And, gradually there's the more, when you give a little bit of freedom, you can't turn off the taps.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not willing to act militarily. And Gorbachev was not ready to enforce Soviet authority anymore in those places. Mm-hmm. So that's really what led to that problem. The punk rock thing, I've heard those same stories. And often you have music of various types that does come to a head in movements that are trying to throw off, a leadership they don't agree with for a variety of different reasons. Mm-hmm. You can see it in places today. No question. You do have back then that was more difficult to get to expose the people in those areas to what the West meant, what freedom meant. We did it through Radio Free Europe largely at the time. So we were able to get some radio signals into those countries. But that builds up over time. It's not going to happen overnight, right. But it builds up over time. And most significantly, if you look at the standard of living in Central and Eastern Europe broadly, it was horrible. It was marginally better in East Germany, marginally better. And the East Germans were able to get TV signals coming across from West Berlin. So they're seeing all the Western culture, the commercials, the TV, MTV, those types of things. That really did have a significant effect there.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of research done on that. And now you're right, but now with the internet, with globalization, there is increasingly an ability to get more into those countries, more Western thoughts and ideas into those countries. And a place like Ukraine has already been largely receptive to that. They've had a number of protest movements. They've had broadly governments that would be characterized as more free and democratic, most assuredly, than the Russian government or Belarus to the north. So there's a sentiment and an appetite therein for that type of rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to touch more into how the culture changes and kind of what we're gonna think's gonna happen in the coming years. But real quick, I wanted to also ask your thoughts on and just researching more of this. Obviously, I'm trying to fully comprehend the relationship, and I guess it's more specifically how. So in 1939, so when Russia invaded Poland, they also did it with Germany.
They struck a separate piece. I mean, the Blitzkrieg came from Germany. They struck a separate piece, and the Russians came in and took the other half. The idea is they'd both control half of Poland, and that'd be a buffer. So Poland's the buffer. So if the Germans decide to attack, they got to go through Poland first.
Okay. And so
you probably read about the Katyn Forest massacre, where basically the entire Polish officer corps was slaughtered by the Russians at that time.
Yeah, and so because I was
those types of things,
and I was trying to really fully comprehend the relationship of Russia and Europe, and obviously the Soviets and that time would have put them head to head with the Nazis and stuff. So they invaded Poland, and then which led to Germany taking the brunt of that blame, which obviously led to World War II, and then both sides obviously. But so is that
left the station long before that?
Okay. So talk to me about how exactly, obviously, World War II was the Soviets were not on the German German side, on the Nazi side. And so I'm trying to, I guess, fully understand the relationship between, and not only militarily, but culturally, of those states in the buffer zone. How did they react to, and how did they respond to, Soviet versus Nazi, being right in the middle of it? That is one of the most fascinating parts of it to me, because that directly will spell out how they react to what we're seeing today.
I think they reacted on the basis of the way that the forces that occupied them at the time did. It wasn't good in either case. It was worse with the Germans initially, but over the long term, it was certainly worse with the Soviets. And so, and particularly if we look at, they kind of judge it by the behavior and the extent to which they were allowed to choose any sort of their own governments, which was, no, they were not. The one case where they had a more of a democratic sentiment was in the Czechoslovakia, and the Russians came in and staged a coup and ended that pretty quickly. So that was the one chance maybe they were going to have been a more slightly democratic country. The one set of countries that was more autonomous during the Cold War, that was not a member of the Soviet Union formally, not necessarily formally a member of the Warsaw Pact, was Yugoslavia. And so Yugoslavia kind of, was broadly affiliated with the Soviets. Was a lot more friendly to the Soviet Union than it was toward the West, but it did have more autonomy of action. And one of the reasons was they had their own authoritarian ruler, Joseph Broz Tito, that was in charge for much of the Cold War until he died in 1985. And really the roots of the problems of the Balkans came after he died. And he was able to keep everything together, use a variety of tools. But so if we look at that, but in Central and Eastern Europe, you're against your state that's occupying you, but there's not much you can do. I don't think they were all loyal and patriotic Russians, to put it mildly.
For sure. Well, and so, and it's because of that, I'm thinking, that in my mind, that would set the stage of the people being more willing to try this NATO thing, be more open to what's happening in the West, because they understand they were occupied, by the Soviets. They were and not only that, I mean, the Soviets and the Nazis, were at opposition, but let's face it, I mean, we're talking about socialists and communists. We're not talking about freedom versus tyranny. We're talking about kind of the same side of the different coin. And so I would hope that, and that certainly the people of those countries, after being occupied by one or the other and seeing the horrors that come with it, would kind of prime them, if you will, to be more open to Western, openness, freedom, more liberal, and I mean that in the classical sense, liberal, form of government. And so
that was most assuredly the case.
Okay.
And in the aftermath of the Cold War, they weren't jumping out of their seats to rejoin what first Boris Yeltsin. Well, there wasn't much to build. They didn't have much of any. They were in bad shape in the 90s in Russia. They weren't going to be propping up anyone really. And survived themselves. But under Putin, 2000 forward, those countries were not looking to join the types of organizations he was involved with. They weren't looking to work through what's known as the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a broad body that was used during the Cold War to bring the United States and Soviets together for arms control and include the Europeans. They weren't reaching out to those types of bodies. They were interested in joining the West because they saw economic benefit there. They saw greater opportunity for freedoms. The only question, they also saw a greater opportunity for security because they're still worried about the Russians, the further east you go in particular. And so they were looking for some sort of security. And there were really only two organizations they could join us that would bring all of those needs or motivations together. And that was the EU and NATO. The original plan that the European Union had, the Treaty of Maastricht of 1992, really formalized the European Union. and discuss movement toward the east to bring in some of these former states. If you look at the objective of the Cold War, at the outside of the Cold War, the phrase that was always mentioned in the West was the objective was to eventually, over many decades, develop a Europe that was whole, free, and at peace.
It's a stated objective, whether they just
whole, free, and at peace. So the free and at peace parts, the latter two in particular, there was not a sense we're going to get any freedoms being affiliated with Russia. Not going to get much economic support there, at least at the time. And maybe they use force against us, so we're not going to be at peace. So we might be whole, but it might be whole in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So the whole was whole, free, and at peace. And the way the way to do that was through the path of the EU and NATO. Originally, the idea was that the EU would go first. We'll lead the way. That came crumbling down in the Balkans, over the next 3 years, 92 to 95, until NATO intervened there. The Eastern and Central European states were watching this go on and thinking, well, what good's it going to do to be in the EU if we face a security threat? They can't do anything about it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it became they pushed for, let's push for NATO first and then the EU second. And that's the way the dual enlargement process unfolded largely. Beginning in 1997 with a commitment to enlarge NATO, and then over time started with the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, and then gradually expanded out to the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. And the EU went second. So it was kind of two waves. You get the security in place first, within the European Union second. And from the Russians' perspective, they didn't like either one of those things.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt to at least bring together a body for discussion. The Russians always wanted to push for the OSCE. The United States said, let's do something more directly. And there was a piece of, an act, there was a measure that's put forward known as the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Joint Council. So once you started having other countries from Central and Eastern Europe come into NATO, they set up that body, and they, for a time, had regular meetings and discussions. And Russia had representation with both the EU and NATO in Brussels. And that's gone back and forth from time to time. Relations with those bodies have not been as useful in recent years, not as useful in 2014 forward after the interventions in Ukraine. But it hasn't been abolished either. It still exists, just not as active as it once was. So there are ways to bring these actors together. And for the Russia part, that collective security treaty organization, they still got that in their back pocket. And in the Russian perspective, maybe we'll take over in Ukraine and put them into that instead. So those are things that they're always important to keep those types of perspectives in mind.
And so really, I kind of, the history of this and everything we've talked about has really been about, military strategy, how long-term planning, not spending resources unwisely, this type of thing. And so, and I kind of touched on it with, technology and stuff. And so I'm interested to see how all of this is going to progress from some of the readings I've done, talking specifically about North Korea, how they're focusing on a lot of their resources and such at building up and training hackers just to come in and steal, frankly, just a bunch of money from different nations and individual actors across the world. And so, again, you're starting to see these, these geographic barriers start to bleed away. And so, number one, number two, with, I would argue there is a little bit of ideological forces here where, the idea of freedom and liberty is that, I don't have to control you, that you can, you're the control your own destiny type of thing. And so I'm curious with all of this, all of this being rising and being more prominent these days, are you going to see less, actual physical conflicts of dropping bombs and sending troops to defend borders, and more of a focus on cyber warfare and misinformation, cultural forces such as that, and really kind of bleeding away. It reminds me of the Austin Powers, whenever they were arguing after he got out of his time machine, and he was saying how he wants to take over the world, and then the other guy he was saying, well, it's not countries anymore, it's all corporations. And that kind of, it kind of seems like those political boundaries are starting to bleed away. So I threw a lot at you, but I mean, how do you feel about, just obviously you've written a lot about the history of military conflict and nations, how they relate to each other. So do you see, hopefully, that Russia understanding all this, or are they going to keep, trying to fight with their with bombs and soldiers?
Well, I mean, I think they're already doing a lot of that.
Yeah.
Here's the distinction to make. So with the military threats and the buildup of forces and sending in special forces and those types of things, those are all very useful tools against a much weaker opponent, over which you have very little fear. So places like Georgia and Ukraine, Russia, you feel comfortable about them doing those types of things. You feel comfortable about sending your forces into Syria to gain naval access to the Mediterranean. You figure the costs are limited. You go and you assist, you maybe prop up regimes in that way. So those traditional tools, I think, are used in those kinds of ways. But when we talk more broadly and globally, in actors that Russia would view as significantly more powerful and significantly more threatening toward its interests, the United States, its allies to a lesser degree, but nevertheless, its European allies. It's with those actors here, you see differently. You see those more technologically advanced tools. You see a lot of cyber warfare types of tools utilized. Sometimes, but not even as often by the government itself. You always find it's easier to find ways to mask those things or use other groups and individuals to carry them out and then say, well, we didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
It's kind of complete ignorance, which is what Russia has done when it's been accused of using these tools against a variety of, whether it's a company organization in the United States, whether it's to shut down a pipeline briefly, whether it's and whether you agree or not with who particular states helped or why, there's no question that the Russians and the Chinese are doing everything they can to create as much domestic polarization and instability as they can. Not doing that by shooting missiles at us or building up forces on our borders. They're doing that through cyber techniques. They're using Facebook. They're using TikTok. They're using Twitter. I mean, these types of tools. So yeah, I definitely see more of that, particularly when it's carried out by actors at the global level. So we look at global level players. China and the United States are certainly the most powerful too. And China's, if they haven't already caught up, they're pretty close. They represent the most significant threat to U.S. interests globally. To me, no question. Russia's an afterthought comparatively. But problem you have there is that Russia still has, between the two of us, have the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. So they've got that in their hip pocket. They do have significant energy resources, whether it be petroleum, but most significantly natural gas. And at the time where they're building them up and using them for leverage, particularly against Germany in this present crisis, through a pipeline they built collaboratively with the Germans, known as Nord Stream 2, to increase the already significant dependence of the Germans. Their bet is that Germany's not going to shut that down, no matter what they do in Ukraine. And the Germans have been non-committal. Just this week, the new prime minister of Germany, Olaf Scholz, met with President Biden in the White House. And afterward, Biden said, yeah, we're going to shut Nord Stream 2 down if Russia invades. And they asked the German chancellor, and he was non-committal. He didn't give any definitive commitment to that. He said, we'll discuss it, basically. So that doesn't suggest to me that we're going to see immediate German action on that front either. So it's that type of leverage and those types of things that are more useful to the Russians. You've got China, you've got Russia, the European Union collectively, particularly on the economic front, is another major player. So you've got those four. And then, looking more in the background, or, certainly in terms of demographics and, growing capabilities, a place like India, as significant. So you do have those other players out there and individual European states, but Europe, really the game is more the EU, in this case, the EU plus the UK now, being that it's out of the EU, still in NATO. But so those types of things are important to consider.
Yeah. And it's interesting you brought up Germany, because actually I brought up this article that was posted today, earlier this, or I guess maybe yesterday, says, let me give you a title and see your reaction to it.
Okay.
Kamala Harris dispatched to Munich conference to talk Ukraine later this month. Vice President Kamala Harris will travel to Munich, Germany later this month for a security conference meant to boost Ukraine against the backdrop of a potential invasion by Russia. Her appearance at the security conference scheduled to take place February 18th to the 20th will demonstrate our ironclad commitment to our NATO allies, reaffirm our shared interest in upholding the principles that we have underpinned European peace and security since World War II, and underscore our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, the White House said in a statement. So it's interesting because, whether it be a Democrat White House led White House or a, Republican led White House, it seems that, obviously their responses will be a little bit different, but it seems like, this rhetoric and desire of, like it says here, of principles that have underpinned European peace and security since World War II and underscore our commitment in Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I say all that to say that, how do you see the different responses from, obviously, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, and do you have any faith in Vice President Harris being able to do anything at this conference?
Well, I would say this. First of all, that's just a token show of solidarity to our European allies.
Yeah.
If one looks at every presidential administration going back many years, the Munich Security Conference is the premier Western security conference at the government and leadership level that there is. They hold it in February every year. Last year they did it virtually because of the the last 2 years of that. 2 years ago, COVID hadn't just quite exploded yet, but they held it virtually last year. They're back to a reduced format this year. I follow it. They give links. You can follow all the proceedings every year. I follow this every year.
Okay.
Each administration.
So I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
At least once out of every 4-year period, as you went back, you would have had a U.S. vice president speaking there.
Okay.
What typically happens with those, it's interesting, the dynamics of it, because they have the German chancellor will always speak, and they'll have the German defense minister speak on the first day. And there you're allowed to have the crowd, the others in the audience are allowed to ask questions. The U.S. doesn't take any questions. It doesn't, not the vice president. Some of the other officials will have the NSC advisor.
Imagine that.
But the U.S., they don't take questions. The U.S., the vice president didn't take any questions. Mike Pence didn't take any questions either when he spoke there. I think he spoke there a couple of different times over the recent years, certainly in the first year of the Trump administration. It's the same purpose there as the fact that we're boosting the number of our forces in current NATO members in Central and Eastern Europe. It's reassurance. I'm not sure about the rhetoric about the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It's fine to say that, but the fact is we don't have a treaty with them. We're not obligated to defend them, and we won't defend them militarily. We'll help them defend themselves. We won't do it militarily. But with all that said, the way I would see it moving forward, and again, the Trump administration didn't have an opportunity to respond to intervention because Putin was smart enough not to try it.
Yeah.
As much as as criticism as President Trump has gotten, some of it's quite warranted, I think. It's more often in terms of his personal comportment and the way he treated the European leaders who met them personally. He was very blunt. They weren't used to that. They didn't like that.
Yeah.
But in terms of one looks at the policy and what actually happened on the ground, the United States gave more support to Ukraine, particularly militarily, under the Trump administration than it did under Obama. It wasn't even close. Obama never sent the lethal defensive weapons requested. Never. He sent him a bunch of blankets and other such stuff, but that didn't do him any good. He responded largely with economic sanctions that in several rounds, and the Europeans joined it, made it uncomfortable economically in some areas for Russia, but a lot of them targeted the elites around Putin. That type of thing doesn't work. They've got assets buried all over the place. They're not going to suffer. The idea is maybe their population suffers enough to put enough pressure on the government. Not in Russia. They just no. It's not going to happen there. It hasn't really happened anywhere we've tried to bring down regimes. It hasn't happened the level that we tried in Iran. It hadn't happened in those kind of places. So that's not going to be as effective. Now, if we look at the possibilities in terms of, first of all, what could happen. I'll mention first what can happen with Russia and Ukraine, and the last thing I want to touch on is the types of tools that can be utilized in response, both before and after this type of action. So Russia's got really, I would say, 4 different things that could be done, and I'll tell you which ones I think are most likely. First, it could just be limited to what we've got now. This military build-up and exercises to attract some sort of concessions from Ukraine, United States, NATO, and or the EU. The concessions from the latter 3 are more in terms of respect, prestige. Maybe we can recreate the European security architecture. Maybe you can pull back. He's throwing stuff pie in the sky stuff. So maybe you'll start to withdraw your forces from NATO, move them back. No, none of that's going to happen. Those are some of the things he's hoping, without even any more action than now. Maybe I can get that. Maybe we can get some more autonomy for the Donbass. Those types of things. That's one thing that could happen. 2, he replicates what he did in Ukraine, largely through special forces, maybe some regular forces. But the idea is that we don't want all of Ukraine. That's not realistic. But we're going to annex the Donbass. We'll hold an election there, and they'll say they want to be Russians, and we'll annex that. That's the second thing that could happen. The third, full invasion, in terms of designed to occupy and exert full control over Ukraine and create a puppet regime moving forward. Needless to say, that's the most extreme. Yeah, I think that's the least likely. And so I think really those first couple options, just try to extract some additional concessions, and at most take all of the Donbass, at least get some concessions there where there's greater autonomy and greater respect for Russia relative to the Ukrainians in that area. Yeah. And so again, I think that one of those first couple are more likely. And I think even with those, there are going to be some costs, because we've sent a great deal more weapons than we sent in the past. Mostly these shoulder-fired missiles you take down tanks with, and some missile defense battery systems, those types of things. So Russia, if they had a substantial invasion, the cost would rise significantly. Not nearly the cost the Ukrainians would have to deal with, but they would rise significantly. And so how can we counter this, or how are we attempting to counter this? The we being the United States and its European allies, NATO, and to a lesser degree, the EU. Well, there are multiple diplomats you've seen just reading through and preparing for this. There are multiple diplomatic tracks of various sorts that have been underway for several months at this point, whether it be bilateral U.S.-Russia, whether it be U.S. Russia-Ukraine back and forth, whether it be NATO, Russia-Ukraine, EU, Russia-Ukraine. And lastly, this is where the Europeans have kind of either purposely or been given the latitude to go off on their own a little bit. And when the original, you had a series of ceasefires after Russia went in 2014, what was known as the Minsk process. This was negotiated between Russia, Ukraine. Wasn't ever very effective either. It kind of had back and forth in terms of flare-ups of violence since. But it was the Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. And with that, they created a new name for this group. It's known as the Normandy Front now. After France, I'm sure Macron's kind of playing a leading role in this, so that's probably why they call it the Normandy, the Normandy Front, or Normandy format, not front, Normandy format group. And so you got all these diplomatic tracks. So maybe we can do something that's going to prevent conflict. And this is where all these demands that I mentioned previously are going back and forth. What we'd like to see from the Russian perspective, what what we, the U.S., would like to see on the Russian side. They haven't really gone anywhere. There's been a lot of good talks, good discussions. We sent our State Department sent some written responses to Russian requests. They largely rejected them. So it's been the diplomacy. And who knows, maybe it will work. I think the fact that this is going on, it's likely to preclude any massive sort of military intervention there. But that's one thing. And the other things we can do is economic sanctions. Again, the types of things we've done in the past has resulted in some pain on the Russians, but they not enough to really prove crippling. There's one thing we could do that would be a lot more crippling. There's an international exchange that used to communicate between banks, known as the SWIFT system. If all Russia's banks were cut off of the SWIFT system, that would be a major, and that's not something they're expecting to happen. They'd have real problems with that. But whether or not we're willing to do that's also open question. It's not just the United States that's in charge, but that's a big problem. That would be a big problem if we're able to do that.
What would that consist of? I would assume obviously a whole host of nations.
Their banks can't participate in the system, and so depending on how much pressure the United States and the Europeans tend to have largest roles therein. The Chinese use that system too, though.
So who would
we're not threatening the Chinese? But
who would make that decision though? Like who could be the one to institute that? The Swiss?
It would have to be instituted multilaterally across all the institutions involved.
Okay.
But with a push, it would have to be a significant push, and we'd have to say, well, if you don't do this, we'll penalize you in some way.
That would be very drastic.
Not sure. I haven't seen the Obama administration suggest it's willing to go that far. But if they did, that would be a much greater cost than Putin was expecting.
Yeah.
And if he thinks that may happen, that might mitigate the likelihood of going in larger force. So that's the other thing. Again, we already are providing ever greater numbers of lethal weapons through our allies. Some have been more reluctant than others to ship them on, including the Germans, who said, "Oh, we're not going to allow shipments to go through here and to Ukraine," which also, again, leaves you concerned how much the Germans are going to be willing to do. And so we're already building up greater NATO force presence in places like Romania, Poland, the Baltics. So that's another thing. That's really more to reassure our European allies than anything else.
Now, when you say we, do you mean American forces specifically, or NATO?
Well, it's American forces under NATO command.
Okay.
America has the most capable forces, NATO. So anytime you talk about NATO, if it's anything significant, there's going to be a significant U.S. role.
Right. I just wasn't sure.
Europeans are going to do on their own.
Yeah, obviously, I know. Obviously, United States is at the forefront.
We're making the weapons and sending it.
Okay, yeah, and because it seems like we usually have the most skin in the game.
Yeah, that's always the case.
Yeah.
So the other two things are delaying an opening or an indefinite closure of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, just about ready to come online. They've been working on this for years. We have exerted pressure on them. Obama didn't do much when it first started. The Trump administration, as you're well aware, did put pressure on Angela Merkel. Trump himself. So one of the things that they didn't like him and he's willing to say, that was the right thing to say, because the Germans are hypocrites. But by talking about, we're not supporting us, all this. Well, what are you doing? You're making a deal with the Russians.
Exactly.
And then just to look at some of the reasons why, because of that, you've had developed a significant dependence on Germany for energy supplies. One of the reasons that happened is because the Germans side, they're very, environmental measures are important to them, but nonetheless, they want to go for natural gas. They shut down their nuclear power industry, much safer, much environmentally friendly than natural gas. Even as we hear from the Biden administration all the time. So we that was holding back our own resources. There, it's like putting the hand behind our back to begin with. Foolish, as far as I'm concerned. But we could talk about that another day.
Yeah.
The other thing is that Gazprom is the primary essentially state natural gas company that ships all these supplies. Can you guess what former German chancellor sits on the board of that organization?
Oh, really? Merkel?
Not Merkel. No, definitely not Merkel.
No. Who is it?
The Gerhard Schroeder. He was the first chancellor that came in after Kohl, served a couple of terms in the aftermath of the Cold War before Merkel put him out of office. So yeah,
Mm.
he's a regular in Moscow. He's formally on the board, has been on the board of the organization for quite some time. So you see some other things are at play here.
Yeah.
As much as the criticism of both administrations having family members or such involved with Russia and all these schemes. Well, look who's sitting on the board, a former chancellor of Germany on the board of this organization. That
Yeah.
also leads me to believe he's still got a lot of pull in Germany. It also leads me to believe I don't think we're going to see the Germans shut it down. And last, and we've done you mentioned cyber warfare tools. Well, the Russians have them. The Chinese have them. So do we. And ours are just as advanced as theirs are. So we can use these types of things against the Russians. So it's not direct military conflict going to kill anybody, but it's going to hurt them in other ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So those are the types of things we could do in response. How it plays out, we'll see.
We'll see.
Those
well, and
my
that so
expectations as it stands now.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, we've been on for a little over an hour, and I think we've covered a lot. Obviously, there's a whole bunch that I could cover within a lot of different scopes. But I guess my last question is kind of a broad picture, because one of the things that I always learn through some of your classes, just studying foreign policy, even some of my classes through Dr. Eichelman and my religion program, is that when you're dealing with foreign policy specifically, always treat the opponent, if you will, as they're competent people who have a set of desires, obviously may not be in line with yours, but that they're competent people and not just reacting off emotion. Sometimes that may be true more than others, but you have to treat them as that they're competent people that understand how to rationally go about the world. And so I guess, and I talked about cyber warfare and the changing of such. But I guess and obviously I don't expect anybody to have the full answer, but we see, okay, how are we going to move forward? And is it, and I have heard from some people argue that Putin is frankly trying to recreate the Soviet Union, and bring that back to the world stage. And I could see where there would be a lot of truth to that. But I guess my question is more of, would this be a return of glory? Would it be a return of a military strategy of just having that buffer and having a large territory? Would it be actually, more ideological, let's push communism? And so how do you see, do you see world powers moving forward? And I guess specifically with Russia in regards to what we're talking about here, are the desires more self-preservation? Is it ideological? Is it, just ego and glory, or is it just a combination of both? And how do you see this all playing? Obviously nobody knows, but how do you expect the world powers of that area to move forward?
I think that, again, it's part of all of those things. But to wrap it up in a nice, neat package, I do think Putin is trying to move in the direction of having influence that is more like was the case during the Cold War. Understanding, even he knows he's not going to be able to achieve that.
Yeah,
but he's going to push as much as he can to do it, as long as the costs are not what he would deem to be too slight. So it's counterproductive, and it ends up costing him domestic support, and there's instability, then it doesn't do you any good. I do see a world more along the line of the great powers that if we looked at the 19th century Europe, in particular, and up through into World War I, you had a period, that great powers era, where you had 4 or 5 significant European continental powers. I think you can have the same type of picture globally. There, in international relations terms, which we've talked about in my classes at times, there are three structures the international system can have. A bipolar system, the model for that is the Cold War. The unipolar system, there was maybe a fleeting moment of that with the United States in the early 90s, but that's long gone. That doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. There was that multipolar system we had in the 19th century Europe. At that time, those great powers were some similar names as we have today. Russia, Prussia, which equals Germany. France, that time was Napoleonic France. Mm-hmm. Austria-Hungary, that's out of the picture now, no longer a great power. And of course, Great Britain, which remains a great power within Europe. But if you look globally, I mentioned earlier, there are really four that I see. China and the United States are in the same category, same types of assets, and China's growing to a relatively more significant rate, particularly in terms of the global influence. There's not necessarily strictly military power, they're trying to do that as well, but it's the influence that China has globally in a variety of ways. Most significant example of this is the Belt and Road Initiative, where it develops economic relationships with states through a variety of means, overland, pipelines, and throughout the developing world. So if you can see significant linkages between the Chinese and states in the developing world, from Asia, lesser degree in Asia these days, but certainly across the greater Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And what the Chinese strategy is, as opposed to the American development strategy and the Western development strategy, the American Western is you try to put in costs on the front end. So before we give you money, you have to make systemic reforms economically and politically. So you want to have a market economy and some measure of, ideally, a liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. But we don't pay too much close attention once you give them the money to following up. So we don't have much luck preventing leaders and their families from pocketing a good share of that money and never getting down to the population. China gives all the money up front, doesn't ask for any, you don't have to design your system a particular way. You won't have to be democratic. We'll accept a little authoritarianism if that's what they're trying to do, but you're not going to have to pay anything on the front end, and doesn't take long. They're in such debt that the Chinese know they're never going to be able to repay the money. Yeah. So the only way they repay it is in kind. So, well, we'll keep this military base, we'll keep this port, we'll run it, we'll run the infrastructure. And so China's basically in charge of those countries moving forward. Right. And we're not. Yeah. And their adversaries are not. And so that's how China is doing it largely. And it's been very effective for the Chinese. So that's not going to change. They're only going to get more powerful. And they're a bigger threat as opposed to the Russians, given the resources they bring to bear. So the United States is still there. And we'll see how that, but in the United States, that by contrast with these authoritarian places, you always have every 2 years in Congress, and every 4 years we have a presidential election. And depending on who's in charge, our approaches to the world can vary. Yeah. Can vary significantly if it's a transition like from Obama to Trump on one hand, or from Trump to Biden on the other. In either case, the policies went in different directions, but they changed drastically very quickly. They did. And so now we're back to the more traditional approach of diplomacy and international organizations, and we might go away from that again with the next election, but we'll see. But so that really, the U.S., I don't think we've had an approach that is consistent like we had during the Cold War, because we didn't have a consistent adversary for that period of time. Things have been kind of working themselves out to where I think that adversary is going to be the Chinese. And so we'll see what type of model is going to work and be effective. But the Chinese have just as many capabilities largely as we do now, which is challenging. And the Europeans, if we look at it, that European bloc, individual countries do have populist strains and do have different political affiliations. But if you look at the EU as a whole, which as a global level actor, those individual countries aren't there anymore. So it has to be the EU as a more broad entity. And they're going to stick with that liberal international order perspective and the institutionalism integration. That's what's worked for Europe. And largely, if we look, and that may be a good positive, optimistic closing point, despite the fact that we have these types of interventions now, small scale largely, we have a lot of rhetoric going back and forth. We haven't had anything even close to the level of conflict, violence, destruction, loss of life in Europe since the end of World War II in 1945, as we did from something between 1914 and 1945. So
Right.
if you look at it from that perspective, I think what we've done's been pretty effective overall.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's, foreign policy is just one of those subjects that is fascinating to me, because I love learning about individuals and psychology and stuff. And so foreign policy and international relations is taking that and blowing it up and blowing it up and blowing it up to where it's on the world stage. And so just learning about how all of these nations relate to each other, you can kind of learn a little bit about just individuals and society themselves, reading about it on a global stage. And so I definitely thank you for coming on and providing. So we had a discussion about Ukraine and Russia about what I guess 2 weeks ago.
Almost exactly 2 weeks.
And so I'm putting this recording out now, and obviously Russia has invaded Ukraine. So I wanted to get you on and get your reaction to the latest news. So today is February 25th. It's about 11 a.m. We're seeing Russia full-scale invasion into Ukraine. What's your thoughts on it?
Okay, well, to start, we discussed this previously. There were a number of different options that could be taken, and most felt that Putin would probably just try to take, if anything, the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. Well, he's clearly gone much further than that, at a point now where the Russian military intervention represents the most significant use of force in Europe in terms of the scope, ferocity of the attack, I would say, and economic, political, security implications, both domestically in Ukraine and more broadly internationally within Europe and globally since World War II. So this is the most significant action militarily we've seen in Europe by far since the end of World War II. Exactly the point of the development of institutions like the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was to try to preclude events like this from occurring ever again.
Yeah.
So that's where we stand.
It's wild. I just saw actually before we got on where Finland and I think Sweden had announced that this had changed their discussion involving them being admitted into NATO, which certainly seems like that was maybe not necessarily the primary goal of Putin, but definitely part of the larger. His mentality is to keep people out of NATO and keep that pressure on them. So I mean, it seems like the goal of them is really kind of being accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, I'd seen a report from Finland. They were actually considering asking for membership in NATO, not the opposite.
Oh, okay. So it's.
But I think the issues are this. Let's talk about that. I mentioned the scope of the attack. You have. When we discussed previously the assets that Russia had built in the region, air, land, and sea. All three of those sets of assets are now being used en masse. You have attacks coming from Russia in the east into the west and eastern Ukraine. You have attacks on a couple of flanks coming from the north from pre-positioned forces in Belarus, which is as staunch an ally of Russia in that region as you will find. And you have naval assets coming in from the south, from the Black Sea and approaching the port of Odessa. You've got Russian forces all across the country, and you've got some pretty significantly fierce fighting. No doubt that Ukraine is taking the worst of it, and then ultimately, just in terms of the pure level of forces, Russia will win this contest.
Yeah.
Russia's objective, and I think this is, I know a little bit more now, at least in terms of what Putin has said, than when we talked the last time. He laid plans like this previously. In fact, in taking a little deeper dive, he put out a written document himself, through the Russian Information Service, the Russian Foreign Ministry, last summer, that really forecasted a lot of what he was going to try to do. And there were many parallels in his remarks on Monday night. This is not just about Ukraine. Certainly got very little to do with NATO. If you look at it in practical terms, NATO was off the table, was not going to be on the table in terms of letting Ukraine in the first place. I don't see NATO taking any new members because of this either. Yeah. But this is more about, and then his rhetoric, it's talking that Ukraine is historically part of Russia. This is part of Russian culture. It's a bunch of nonsense, historically inaccurate nonsense, propaganda. What we would expect from Russia broadly and Putin in particular. Assuming that's kind of the justification that he uses. If you listen to some of the rhetoric and what he said, it's even more dangerous. It's not because he made some comments that had to do with Poland being really a part of Russia, the Baltics really being a part of Russia. Those are NATO member states. So,
and he's using from what I understand, he was saying he was trying to denazify Ukraine, which I mean is obviously heated rhetoric.
Yeah, more utter nonsense, propaganda meant for a domestic audience, and we'll see how it plays over time. Russia, Putin has such an ironclad control over that country. It's hard to see, although there are protests, many parts of Russia being reported against this action. It's hard to see, at least in the short term, that really having much of an effect.
Being significant.
He'll simply be arrested by the thousands and thrown in the gulag. That's just the blunt way of putting it. The other thing that from the videos, if you've probably seen with Putin sitting at the head of a table and having his minions give reports and him berating them one after the other. This looks like an old Soviet propaganda movie.
It does.
So this has gone significantly further than anything Putin has attempted before. He's talking about redoing the security architecture, the post-Cold War security architecture, to reflect more what we saw the Warsaw Pact. So he's making a lot of big claims and suggestions about what might be to come. I'm still, the costs, Ukraine's one thing, and I think you're going to see mounting costs there militarily for Russia. Certainly not stopping them from winning there, but you have a set of sanctions coming in. So there are a number of consequences that are going to be coming across for Russia as a result of this. I'm not sure they're strong enough yet, and ultimately, I'm not sure there's much of anything the United States and the West can do in terms of economic sanctions or even force buildups in NATO member states such as the Baltics and Poland. These things are occurring. Thousands more U.S. forces are going in there, mostly through Germany and then to those other states. But I'm not sure those types of actions, in fact, those types of actions will not reverse what he has done in Ukraine. If you look historically, it's like thinking as Russia was sweeping across Europe, pushing German forces back toward Nazi Germany in World War II. The moment every bit of that territory was taken, none of it was returned until the end of the Cold War. So once Russia sees this territory, they're not giving it back. There's nothing that's going to be given back. I would count on Russia for one form or another being in control of Ukraine at this point, most likely by installing a puppet regime. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Ukrainian civilians continue to fight back over the longer term, and that insurgency strategy may be one that we want to support. That there's been some discussion of that within the Biden administration. I would support that. I think we need to make this as difficult as possible for Russia. You understand we're not going to stop them from, I don't think, seizing Ukraine at this point, but we need to make it as costly as we possibly can, both on the ground in Ukraine and through the sanctions that are imposed. Again, economic sanctions will only get you so far. Thus far, what's been done, I would say the strongest steps that have been taken, and there's a lot more that would need to come before this, I think, is really exacting significant cost on the Russians. But Germany essentially taking off certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is something that
Yeah.
has been a major issue for basically since the construction started. Now, one clarification on this, we will often hear this discussion about Nord Stream 2. That's going to have, until an economic cost, both for Germany and for Russia, it's not going to happen now. It wasn't open yet. There is another pipeline directly above that that already goes through that region, Nord Stream 1. So you're not cutting off anything now. Or you're not. This is more a future problem. It's a significant one, but it's a future problem. But to take a step like that, Germany has declined this step since the Trump administration began requesting it early in that administration. So it's a big step. The Germans to take that course of action. That's a very strong move by Germany. However, the Germans, and they're the most powerful country economically in Europe, they're still dragging their heels a bit, and there are understandable reasons. Let me talk about broadly in terms of why Russia is able to do this now. I would say the preliminary card that Vladimir Putin has is one with respect to energy, both natural gas and oil. If we look in Europe, most significantly in Europe, and across all member states in the European Union, collectively, 30% of their natural gas comes from Russia right now. Wow. 25% of the oil comes from Russia right now. The one state that is not really facing this challenge is the United Kingdom, NATO member state, no longer an EU member state, but does not have nearly that significance of reliance on the Russians. So they don't have that problem. And some of the stronger sanctions in terms of banking assets and oligarchs, these things have already been put in place by the British. They have less to lose. Germany, among those powers in the EU, the major powers in the EU, Germany, 39% of its natural gas comes from Russia.
Wow.
France, 25%. Italy, 30%. So those are the key players there. France is a little bit less hamstrung on that issue, but Germany in particular, most powerful economically, they've got that reliance on the Russians. The Russians have a big card in their hand there because, and one of probably the most significant economic sanction that's been threatened, pushed for by the Biden administration, and rightly so, to try to exclude Russia altogether from the SWIFT exchange system, which is an international banking exchange system whereby you send electronic messages from one bank to another. You can transfer back and forth basically on the spot.
Yeah.
There's some 200 countries involved in this. The push in the United States and the thing that's holding this back is to exclude Russia from that system.
For sure.
Trouble is that economic, just one quick point, sorry, that economic reliance of those states, the money exchanges to pay for that gas back and forth go through that system. So the two principal European states against this right now, Germany and Italy.
And that was going to, so kind of building off of that does the Normandy format come into play regarding that? Did they, I mean, I know it wasn't necessarily.
The Normandy format is essentially what that relates to is France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. It was a kind of a way to engage in negotiations to try to advance these two issues. It's a build on in the aftermath of Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2014. There was eventually a ceasefire reached.
But it doesn't have to do with the energy.
No.
Okay.
This had to do more with a diplomatic process to try to bring stability back and not have all the killing.
I see.
That ended, as far as that negotiation process, that's over. Today, the moment Russian forces went in, initial forces, so-called peacekeepers, Monday night, that ended. And any chance to reopen any negotiations now, and this is across the board, whether it be Biden, Putin, Secretary of State Blinken, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, that's all closed off. There's not going to be negotiations at this point.
Right. Yeah, well, that certainly makes sense. One of the sources that I've seen, and it's hard to know what's the truth and what's real these days, but one of the sources I did see said that Putin had issued 2 demands to withdraw Russian forces, and that was a commitment to not enter NATO and to cease all talks, and removal of all foreign weapons from within Ukraine, including U.S. backed and NATO weapons. Have you seen that? Is that true, or or
I believe I saw. I mean, this idea of NATO, that's been on Putin's tongue from beginning to end of this. The point
yeah,
is, there haven't been any negotiations open. There's nothing to close off,
yeah,
and there's never been any for practical purposes. If you talk behind closed doors, there's no appetite whatsoever in the West to enlarge NATO any further.
but I guess
Ukraine, no, it's just not there.
yeah,
Putin's using this as more of a
tool.
false premise than anything else.
But as far as the weapons, I mean, they're
Now the weapons are a different thing.
okay.
The weapons have been sent to Ukraine by by the United States and NATO members collectively.
Mhm.
These are weapons, are defensive weapons. They're lethal weapons, but they're meant to defend, to help the Ukrainians to defend themselves against Russian advances. So if there wasn't a Russian advance, there would not be weapons being shipped.
Right. So anti-air weapons, that type of such.
The biggest thing, and this is an interesting parallel to draw here, particularly as this becomes more extended insurgency right now as well. But one of the most significant weapons that we've sent to the Ukrainians are these shoulder-fired anti-tank systems, very similar to some much more advanced today. But we did the same thing. If you think all the way back to the last time the Soviet Union and Russia had this type of major intervention was Afghanistan in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
The insurgents there ultimately brought the Soviets down by using Stinger missiles, take their helicopters down.
Yeah.
This, not the helicopters so much, now it's Russia's tanks, which Ukraine can't match unless they can defend against them with these shoulder-fired missile systems.
Yeah.
So those are predominant among the thinking, but we're also anything from that right down to small arms.
Right.
And the Ukrainians, in fact, the Ukrainian police are issuing weapons to retired members of the military.
That's what I saw.
I've seen women. I saw a very poignant photograph in an interview last night with a member of the Ukrainian parliament holed up in his apartment, fearful that the rumored death lists that have been circulated by the Russian forces to decapitate Ukraine politically as quickly as possible and simply put in a puppet regime with Ukrainians like they've essentially had done in the past.
Right.
And so he was there discussing the situation, and he had his own assault rifle in his lap.
Wow. It's wild seeing all this play out over social media in real time. Regardless of everyone's position on the war and the policies and all this, it is really cool and really I'm not sure of the words, but I love seeing the Ukrainian people have that spirit of regardless of how much we may or may not be outgunned or outmatched, we're going down with a fight. They're defending their homes, like you said. They're giving out firearms to fight off the tanks or anything that's in their neighborhoods. What was I guess there was a island that some 13 Ukrainians died after telling the Russian warships to go F themselves.
Yeah, and then they were killed.
Yeah, so
it's poignant, but it's also when you try to put yourself in that situation, and what length will one go through to defend their country. And for Ukrainians, an order and a request for order has gone out for all Ukrainians from 18 to 65 males not to leave the country and prepare to defend it street by street. Yeah. So I think that again, Russia is not going to be stopped, but the attrition, if this were to continue over a period of time, these things don't go completely unreported. Putin's able to clamp down a great deal more than a lot of countries on information available within Russia, but you're not going to stop these types of things coming out. When you do have casualties and you start seeing some Russians soldiers coming back home in body bags, that causes protest. It is what really led to in Afghanistan that episode. Just apples and oranges to some extent, but that led to the beginning of the Cold War because of protests within Russia and all these soldiers being killed or maimed or otherwise. Same types of things we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq.
It
and
was, it
drove us out
wasn't,
of both those places.
well, I was about to say, was it, that kind of reminds me of Vietnam. I mean, that was kind of the same
That's
thing in
similar
Vietnam.
too. That was
They,
their Vietnam, Afghanistan, and you can draw parallels to our own country. What
mhm,
happened in Vietnam? Eventually, it couldn't be maintained. There was too much public pressure to continue, and it
mhm,
ended.
yeah,
And to some extent, you could draw those same parallels to our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while, 20 years in Afghanistan, but eventually, yeah, the war was progressively grew less and less popular and less accepted by the population. So these are the types of things that leaders need to keep in mind. And so we'll see how it plays out. And the extent to which Putin has underestimated things. But if the United States could do something more, I'm skeptical. I'd be very pleased if I heard an announcement like this. But essentially, we've been fighting this from the outset of the Biden administration, with one hand but tied behind our backs, simply because, and it's a decision one can make, but the decision the administration made was to privilege the battle against climate change by cutting way back on fossil fuel production. We'd gone right up in the other direction over the previous 4 years of the Trump administration, whether you agree with it or not. In terms of long term, you could make a case that this is a significant threat, perhaps, with climate change, and we need to move in the other direction. But short term, it very much is backfired.
yeah,
And what I'm interested to see is whether there will be any retrenchment there, whether we'll go in the other direction at all. Well, maybe we want to open up some of those resources to make it a little bit easier to begin producing them at the rate we were before the start of the Biden administration. But
yeah,
there's no question whatsoever that this has put Vladimir Putin in a much better position economically to do the things that he's doing now.
yeah,
And it continued now, even at this stage, because anytime you have a war, particularly in an area like this, that energy issue, we've already had rising fuel prices here globally. Price of oil is up almost $100 a barrel now,
yeah,
significant increase. And the reason, so you have to think, well, that's the cost. That gives power to someone like Putin to do the things he's doing now. So you have to make a choice.
for
And
sure.
maybe you can strike a balance between the two. But to continue, just stay the course with the reduction of fossil fuel reliance over the short term is foolish.
I agree. Yeah, I'm seeing tons of posts and people talking about how we need to become, how this is open their eyes more to becoming energy independent through whichever means, whether it be some new trend or going back to like you said, natural resources. But well, sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and get this interview posted and conversation posted. Anything else?
Okay.
Is there anything I mean, we need to close up. I mean, obviously it's real time and things are breaking and can change within the hour.
I think the
But
most significant thing here is to maintain transatlantic solidarity to the extent we possibly can, and to make it very clear to our allies, U.S. allies in NATO, situated in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly those bordering this area of conflict now. Romania comes to me, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland in particular, and certainly the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that we stand firm by our Article 5 security guarantee that an attack on one NATO state is an attack on all. I'm still somewhat hopeful that Vladimir Putin would have the sense not to take that type of action. I don't think he would take that action at this point, because then you do have a trigger that the United States is going to be in the game.
mm-hmm.
We're not going to ignore our treaty obligations. So we did. We basically have two options. Either you maintain that commitment, and we fight you counter the Russians whatever ways we have to, or we just sort of wrap it up and throw the alliance away. Because if that Article 5 security guarantee is not adhered to, then NATO is worthless.
Right.
So I would just say that.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly going to be interesting and important to watch.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll get you on and we can discuss the next week's happenings.
Maybe we'll have something more pleasant to discuss the next time.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. Well, I appreciate it. Now I'll let you know when I get this up. Thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure talking with you. You take care, Shay.